There is a building in Philadelphia that has never stopped working. It stands today where it has always stood, at the corner of 8th and Pine, in the heart of a city that has grown and changed and nearly destroyed itself a dozen times over. Its brick facade is worn smooth by centuries of weather. Its windows have looked out over horse-drawn carts and electric streetcars and the endless noise of modern life. And through all of it, the sick have kept coming through its doors. But do not let the quiet dignity of those walls fool you. Behind them, patients were strapped to a table, while hundreds of strangers packed into tiered rows above them, watching, as surgeons operated on living flesh. The sounds of those procedures, witnesses would later recall, carried all the way to the street outside. Behind them, men and women deemed mad were locked in basement cells barely large enough to lie down in, displayed like curiosities to a paying public who came to stare. Behind them, a plague tore through the most powerful city in a young nation, killing nearly 1 in 10 of its people. And the doctors who stayed behind to fight it did so with tools that sometimes made things worse. And behind them, a group of women who had every right to be there were driven from a lecture hall by a mob of their own colleagues, pelted with spitballs and tobacco, jeered at, and physically assaulted for daring to study medicine. This is not a simple story of progress. This is the story of a place where the very worst and the very best of American medicine happened in the same rooms, sometimes in the same breath. A place built on a radical act of compassion, and shaped just as powerfully by cruelty, ignorance, and the slow, agonizing cost of getting things wrong. How did one building become both the cradle of American medicine and a mirror of its darkest impulses? That is what we are here to find out. Chapter 1. A City in Crisis. To understand why Pennsylvania Hospital existed at all, you have to understand the world it was born into. By the middle of the 18th century, Philadelphia was the fastest-growing city in the American colonies, and one of the most dangerous places on the continent to fall ill. Its population had swelled from roughly 11,000 in 1730 to nearly 15,000 by 1750, and it showed no signs of slowing. Ships arrived daily from Europe, the Caribbean, and West Africa, unloading cargo, passengers, and disease. The streets were dense and poorly maintained. Waste ran in open channels. The air in summer was thick and foul, and the people kept coming, crowding into a city that had neither the infrastructure nor the institutions to absorb them. The diseases came with them. Smallpox moved through the population in waves, disfiguring and killing indiscriminately. Dysentery was so common, it was almost unremarkable. Respiratory illnesses tore through the poorer neighborhoods every winter, and lurking at the edges, arriving without warning on the ships from the south, was yellow fever. By the end of the 17th century, Philadelphia's death rate had already begun to exceed its birth rate. The city grew only because newcomers never stopped arriving. Without that constant influx, it might have simply consumed itself. And yet, if you were poor and sick in Philadelphia in 1750, your options were almost non-existent. The wealthy could afford to summon a physician to their homes. There were no medical schools in colonial America. University-trained doctors were extraordinarily rare. One historian estimated that, by the 1770s, fewer than 200 men in all of the British North American colonies held actual medical degrees, most earned in London or Edinburgh. Everyone else was working largely from observation, tradition, and guesswork, and their tools were frightening. The dominant medical philosophy of the era held that illness was caused by imbalances within the body, and that the cure was to force the body back into balance through drastic intervention. Physicians bled their patients aggressively. They administered powerful purgatives. They prescribed compounds of mercury. These treatments were not fringe practices. They were the mainstream. They were what passed for medicine. For those who could not afford even that, there was the almshouse, a public institution that housed the destitute, the elderly, the orphaned, the mentally ill, and the physically sick, all under the same roof, with no meaningful distinction between them and no serious attempt at treatment. It was not a place of healing. It was a place of last resort, where people went when there was nowhere else to turn, and where many of them did not survive. Something had to change. The city was growing too fast, suffering too visibly, and failing its most vulnerable people too completely for the situation to continue. The idea of a dedicated hospital was not merely a good idea in Philadelphia in 1750. It was a revolutionary one. Chapter 2: Franklin, Bond, and a Radical Idea. The idea began with a doctor who could not get anyone to listen to him. Dr. Thomas Bond had spent years practicing medicine in Philadelphia, and he had watched the city's suffering long enough to understand what was missing. He had trained primarily in Paris, where voluntary hospitals, institutions funded by private charity and dedicated solely to the care of the sick poor, had already taken root and proven their worth. He had also visited hospitals in London, where the model was similarly established. He had seen what organized, concentrated medical care could do for a population that would otherwise have none. And when he returned to Philadelphia, he became convinced that the same model could work in the colonies. In 1749, Bond began quietly soliciting donations. He approached the city's merchants, its civic leaders, its men of means and influence. He made his case clearly and sincerely, and almost without exception, he was turned away. The pattern was always the same. Prospective donors would listen politely, ask a few careful questions, and then ask one question in particular. What did Benjamin Franklin think of the scheme? Bond had not yet consulted him, and until he did, no one was willing to commit. It was not an insult. It was simply the reality of Philadelphia in 1750. Benjamin Franklin was, by that point, already one of the most admired and trusted figures in the colonies. He had built his reputation as a printer and publisher, as the author of Poor Richard's Almanac, as a scientist whose experiments with electricity had made him famous on both sides of the Atlantic. But more than any of that, he was known as a man of almost uncanny practical judgment, someone who could look at a complicated problem and find the lever that would move it. If Franklin endorsed your cause, people paid attention. If Franklin worked for your cause, things got done. Bond went to Franklin. Franklin listened, and then, in his own words, he not only subscribed to the idea himself, but engaged heartily in the design of procuring subscriptions from others. What followed was a masterpiece of civic engineering. Franklin understood immediately that the hospital's greatest obstacle was not public indifference. It was political. The Pennsylvania Assembly, which controlled the public funds that would be needed to sustain the institution, was dominated by rural representatives who saw little reason to spend colonial money on an institution that would primarily serve the city. Franklin's solution was elegant and unprecedented. He proposed a conditional grant. If private citizens could raise £2,000 through voluntary subscription, the Assembly would match it with £2,000 of public money. Neither side would commit without the other. The risk was shared. The incentive was mutual. His opponents in the Assembly thought the condition would never be met. They considered the private fundraising target. Franklin later recalled a most extravagant supposition, and utterly impossible. Franklin raised £2,700 in weeks. On the 11th of May, 1751, the Pennsylvania Assembly granted a charter to Pennsylvania Hospital, the first institution of its kind, chartered in what would become the United States of America. The seal chosen by Franklin and Bond to represent the institution was the image of the Good Samaritan, the biblical figure who stopped to care for a stranger, left beaten and dying by the side of the road. Beneath the image ran an inscription, a fragment of the parable's dialogue, quiet and direct. "Take care of him, and I will repay thee." It was not a grand declaration. It was a promise. The hospital's early days were modest by necessity. A temporary facility opened in 1752 in the former home of Judge John Kinsey, a Quaker who had recently died, on High Street, then known as Market Street, not far from what is now Independence Hall. A Quaker widow named Elizabeth Gardner was appointed as the institution's first matron, overseeing a ward that was already straining to meet the city's need. The first patients were formally admitted in February of 1753. The permanent building came slowly. Franklin personally composed the inscription carved into the cornerstone when the east wing was laid at 8th and Pine Streets in 1755. When patients were finally moved to the new permanent building in 1756, the institution's mission was stated in language that was remarkable for its time. The hospital existed to care for the sick poor and the insane of Philadelphia. Not just the physically ill, not just the deserving poor or the respectable working man fallen on hard times. The insane, the people that colonial society had no framework for treating, no patience for housing, and no language for understanding beyond the vocabulary of shame and confinement. From the very first day its doors opened, Pennsylvania Hospital accepted patients that no other institution in the colonies would take. That choice, quiet and practical, would define the hospital's character and haunt it for the next 2 centuries. Chapter 3: The Basement Cells. They were kept in the cellar. From the earliest days of Pennsylvania Hospital, the patients designated as lunatics, the word the era used without hesitation, were housed in the basement of the building. The cells were small, roughly 10 feet square, with thick walls, heavy doors, and very little light. Ventilation was poor. Heating, in the brutal Philadelphia winters, was almost non-existent. The patients who lived in those rooms were not there because the hospital's founders were cruel. They were there because nobody, anywhere in the colonial world, had yet developed a coherent idea of what else to do with them. This was, in its grim way, still a form of progress. Across the colonies and throughout Britain, the mentally ill were typically handled in one of 3 ways. They were confined at home, kept hidden by families too ashamed or too exhausted to seek outside help. They were imprisoned alongside criminals in the common jails, shackled and forgotten. Or they were simply turned out into the city's streets, left to wander and suffer in public. Precisely the condition that had helped motivate the hospital's founding in the first place. Pennsylvania Hospital offered something different: shelter, some degree of supervision, and the theoretical possibility of treatment. That it fell short of anything we would recognize as humane today does not diminish how unusual it was for its time. What does diminish it considerably is what happened next. The hospital, perpetually short of funds and perpetually searching for ways to generate revenue, began charging admission. For a small fee, members of the Philadelphia public could enter the hospital and observe the patients in the basement cells. They came on weekends. They came in groups. They peered through the doors and the grated windows at the people locked inside, who were described in the hospital's own records and in contemporary accounts as objects of curiosity, spectacles to be witnessed rather than human beings to be treated. It was a practice borrowed, consciously or not, from institutions like Bethlem Royal Hospital in London, known to everyone by its shortened name, Bedlam. At Bedlam, viewing the patients had been a popular public entertainment for over a century. Philadelphia, in this regard, was simply following an established tradition. That tradition would not be seriously challenged at Pennsylvania Hospital until a physician named Benjamin Rush walked through its doors. Rush joined the hospital's medical staff in 1783, and he would remain there until his death 30 years later. He was, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary figures in the early history of American medicine, and one of its most complicated. He had signed the Declaration of Independence. He had served as a military physician during the Revolutionary War and written a treatise on military medicine that would guide the nation's armed forces for decades. He was a teacher, reformer, a prolific writer, and a man of almost ferocious intellectual energy who seemed constitutionally incapable of leaving any problem alone once he had identified it. He was also, in ways that would only become fully apparent in retrospect, sometimes spectacularly wrong. When Rush first encountered the hospital's psychiatric patients, his response was immediate and genuinely compassionate. He had stoves installed to provide heat in winter. He ordered that patients be allowed to take walks outside their confinement. He insisted they be treated by the medical staff rather than simply warehoused. He argued in an era when madness was widely considered either a moral failing or a divine punishment. That mental illness was a medical condition, something that had causes, and therefore might have treatments. For this, and for the body of work it eventually produced, he is remembered today as the father of American psychiatry. His portrait appears on the official seal of the American Psychiatric Association to this day. But Rush's treatments were a window into the limits of his era as much as its ambitions. He believed, with complete conviction, that mental illness was rooted in the blood, specifically in an irregular excitement of the vessels of the brain. The logical consequence was that the cure for madness was the same as the cure for almost everything else in Rush's medical universe: reduce the excess, bleed the patient, purge them. And later in his career, around 1810, he designed a device he called the tranquilizing chair. The stated theory was that by eliminating all movement and stimulation, the brain's overexcited vessels would calm. The practice was, by most modern assessments, a form of extreme restraint dressed in the language of medicine. Rush defended it. He defended the bloodletting too. He was not a sadist. He was a man who believed deeply in his own theories and pursued them with a consistency that made him both a genuine innovator and, at times, a genuine danger to his patients. In 1794, after years of advocacy, Rush finally won approval for a separate dedicated wing to house the hospital's psychiatric patients, the first such designated space in American medicine. It was a landmark achievement. The ward was overcrowded almost immediately. That overcrowding would become a defining feature of the hospital's psychiatric history. As word spread that Pennsylvania Hospital treated the insane with something approaching humanity, patients arrived from across the region. The building strained to hold them. The staff strained to treat them. By 1841, the situation had become untenable, and the hospital made the decision to separate its psychiatric population entirely, transferring them to a newly constructed facility in West Philadelphia, the Institute of Pennsylvania Hospital, under the superintendence of a physician named Thomas Story Kirkbride. Kirkbride would go on to become one of the most influential figures in the history of American institutional psychiatry. His design philosophy for psychiatric hospitals became known as the Kirkbride Plan, and it shaped the construction of asylums across the United States for the next half-century. More than 70 institutions were built on his model. Some of them still stand. All of it traced back in some way to those basement cells at 8th and Pine, to the decision, radical in its moment, that the people locked inside them deserved something better than what they had been given. The hospital had made that promise. Keeping it would prove considerably harder. Chapter 4: The Theater of Agony. By 1804, the hospital had a new room at the top of its building. It was circular. Its walls rose in tiered wooden benches, row after row climbing upward toward a domed ceiling. At the apex of that dome sat a single large skylight, the room's only source of illumination, an eye of glass open toward the sky. At the center of the floor, directly beneath it, stood the operating table. The room seated 180 people comfortably. On days when demand was high, up to 300 could be packed into the space, standing along the walls, leaning over the railings, pressed together in the upper rows. It looked, in every meaningful sense, exactly like what it was called, a theater. The audience sat above. The work happened below. The only difference between this room and any other theater in Philadelphia was what occurred on its stage. Surgery at Pennsylvania Hospital was scheduled only on clear days and only between 11 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon, not by preference but by necessity. The skylight was the room's sole source of light, and the surgeons needed to see what they were doing. Cloudy days meant postponements. The sun was not a convenience. It was a medical instrument, and the sun illuminated everything. There was no anesthesia. The science that would eventually make it possible did not yet exist in any practical form, and would not arrive at Pennsylvania Hospital until the 1840s, 4 decades after the amphitheater opened. There were no antiseptics. The understanding that microscopic organisms caused infection and death had not yet entered medical thinking. Surgeons operated in their street clothes. The concept of sterilizing one's hands and surgical area was not thought of yet. They did not wash their hands between patients, and this applied to the surgical instruments used as well. Nobody understood why this was dangerous, because nobody yet understood what danger looked like at a microscopic level. What they offered a patient before the procedure began was limited. Whiskey or rum if you wanted it, opium only if available. A piece of leather or bark was placed between the patient's teeth. Straps were secured across the body to prevent movement and to prevent further issues during a surgery. The table itself was designed with practical channels to manage what the procedure produced, and sawdust was spread across the floor below. Then the surgeon stepped forward, and the room went quiet. The sounds that followed could be heard from the street outside the hospital. Witnesses described this plainly and without apparent need for elaboration. You did not need to be inside the amphitheater to know that a surgery was underway. The city knew because the sound traveled. Inside the room, the surgeon worked in near total silence. This was not indifference. It was a discipline, born of the understanding that every word spoken, every flicker of expression, every hesitation or glance was being read by 300 pairs of eyes in the tiers above, interpreted for meaning and analyzed. The audience watched the surgeon's hands, they watched his face, and the patient. The surgeon communicated with his assistants through glances and nods, through the silent language of people who had worked together long enough to need no words. Speed was not a virtue in that room. It was the difference between a patient who survived and a patient who did not. Without anesthesia, the human body in extreme duress can be fatal. Without the ability to manage blood loss beyond the most basic methods, a prolonged surgery was also fatal. The great surgeons of the era were not celebrated for their elegance or thoroughness, but for how fast they could finish. Then, in 1794, came Philip Singh Physic. He had trained in London under John Hunter, the most celebrated surgeon in Britain, a man who had transformed surgery from a trade practiced by barbers into something approaching a scientific discipline. Physic had absorbed Hunter's methods, his precision, his insistence on understanding what the body was actually doing, rather than simply cutting and hoping. When Physic returned to Philadelphia and joined the hospital's staff, he brought that discipline with him and applied it in the amphitheater with a consistency and skill that made him, within a few years, the most sought-after surgeon in America. His contemporaries described him in terms that sound almost inhuman. Pale-skinned, his face described as if chiseled from marble, his manner cold and controlled in the operating space. He did not perform for the audience. He did not speak unnecessarily. He just simply worked, with a speed and precision that his students, who later transcribed his lectures and built their own careers on his methods, struggled to adequately describe. Physic's contributions to the practice of surgery were genuine and lasting. He developed the stomach pump. He introduced absorbable sutures which dissolved naturally inside the body, eliminating the secondary procedure of removing the stitches. He invented needle forceps and a surgical device for removing tonsils. Such tools were important to keep the area sterile. He trained a generation of American surgeons who carried his methods across the country. In 1805, a man named James Hayes came to the hospital with a substantial tumor growing from his parotid gland, which was located just below the ear. Physic removed it. The following year, Hayes returned. A second tumor had grown in its place, larger than the first. Physic removed that one too. The larger of the two tumors weighed 7 pounds. It was preserved after the operation and remains in the hospital's historic collections to this day, a monument to what surgery looked like before the age of imaging and sterile technique. In 1831, Chief Justice John Marshall of the United States Supreme Court, then in his 76th year, came to Philadelphia to be treated for a debilitating bladder condition. Physic operated. According to hospital records, he removed over 1,000 individual kidney stones. Marshall recovered completely. But it is worth pausing before the legend grows too large to ask a question the amphitheater's records do not always make easy to answer. Who were the patients on that table? Not the famous cases preserved in the annals of medical history. The others, the ones who filled the operating schedule on ordinary days, whose names do not appear in the textbooks. They were the poor, the sick, and the destitute, the people who had no physician they could summon to their home, no private arrangement, no means of obtaining treatment anywhere else. The wealthy of Philadelphia did not submit themselves to surgery in a room full of strangers. They had other options. The amphitheater was for people who had none. And for those people, the risk did not end when the surgeon stepped back. Without antiseptics, the wound left by even a successful operation was dangerously exposed to infection. The instruments that had touched one patient touched the next. Post-operative infection was not a complication to be avoided. It was a near certainty to be survived or not, as chance and constitution allowed. Many did not survive it. The amphitheater operated for 64 years. In those 6 decades, it served as the primary site of surgical education in America. It also stands as the earliest confirmed site of its kind in America. Hospital co-founder Dr. Thomas Bond had already performed what records describe as the first surgical stone extraction in the colonies here in the autumn of 1756, nearly half a century before the amphitheater above him was ever built. It stood at the top of the building, under its glass eye, catching the light. And the city, just outside, learned to recognize the sounds that came from it. Chapter 5. The City Burns. The summer of 1793 was the hottest anyone in Philadelphia could remember. The humidity was suffocating. The streets, always foul, had grown worse. Rotting cargo sat uncollected along the wharves, and the stench of decay hung over the waterfront district like a physical presence. Mosquitoes, which nobody yet understood to be carriers of anything beyond ordinary nuisance, swarmed in numbers that contemporaries described as extraordinary, even by the standards of a Philadelphia summer. In July, people began to die. The disease moved fast. A person could be entirely well in the morning and gravely ill by afternoon. Within days of the fever's peak, the jaundice would set in, turning the skin and the whites of the eyes a deep, unmistakable yellow. Then came further deterioration, internal hemorrhaging, organ failure, and a progression that physicians of the era found almost impossible to slow. Roughly half of everyone who contracted the disease died from it. In the hottest weeks of that summer, the death carts moved through the streets at a rate that shocked even a city already accustomed to epidemic loss. The disease had arrived, as best as anyone could later determine, on ships carrying refugees from the Caribbean island of Saint-Domingue, what is now Haiti, where a revolution was tearing the French colonial order apart. The refugees brought the fever with them, or the mosquitoes that carried it did, spreading into the dense waterfront neighborhoods the moment the vessels docked. Philadelphia, in 1793, was a city of roughly 50,000 people. It was also the capital of the United States, and it was completely unprepared for what was about to happen to it. Pennsylvania Hospital, the institution built to care for exactly this kind of catastrophe, could do almost nothing. The hospital's founding policies, explicitly written into its governing rules, did not permit the admission of patients with infectious diseases. The concern was containment, that admitting fever patients would expose staff and the patients already inside. The reasoning was understandable given what medicine knew at the time, but the practical consequence was stark, as the worst epidemic in the history of North America tore through the city block by block. The institution built to serve Philadelphia's suffering kept its doors closed to those dying from this particular affliction. This was not an oversight or an accident of history. It was a deliberate institutional policy, one that the hospital's founders had written in, and one that the epidemic now exposed in its full inadequacy. The city's leadership, faced with a crisis their institutions were not built to handle, largely fled. Members of Congress departed Philadelphia. Cabinet members left. George Washington withdrew to his estate at Mount Vernon, attributing his exit to concern for his wife's health. Roughly 20,000 people, nearly half the city's population, abandoned Philadelphia entirely by the end of September. Benjamin Rush did not leave. The man whose contradictions had already defined a decade of Pennsylvania Hospital's psychiatric ward now stood at the center of the worst public health disaster in American history, and he chose to stay in it. He wrote to his wife, who had taken their children to safety in New Jersey, with the plain observation that parents were deserting their children as soon as they were infected, and that in every room you entered, you saw no person but a solitary black man or woman near the sick. He lost his sister to the fever. He contracted it himself and nearly died. He recovered, went back to work, and kept going. His courage was real and unambiguous. His medicine was another matter. Rush treated yellow fever the way he treated almost everything, aggressively, systematically, and in accordance with theories that were confidently held and badly wrong. He bled his patients. He believed the fever was caused by local conditions, rotting vegetation, foul air, the filth of the waterfront, and that the cure was to drive the affliction from the body by force. Some of his colleagues disagreed publicly, advocating milder treatments. The resulting argument between Philadelphia's physicians became as much a political controversy as a medical one. Rush's critics argued that his treatments were accelerating his patients' decline. His defenders argued the opposite. The patients caught between competing theories had little say in the matter. The people who filled the gap, quietly, without institutional support, at enormous personal cost, were not physicians at all. Rush, acting on a belief that black Philadelphians possessed a natural immunity to yellow fever, had written to the leaders of the Free African Society, asking them to provide nurses and burial workers for the stricken city. Absalom Jones and Richard Allen, the society's founders, agreed. Hundreds of black men and women took on the most dangerous and grueling work the epidemic produced, nursing the sick, removing the dead, staffing the makeshift fever hospital established at a private estate called Bush Hill on the edge of the city. Rush was wrong about the immunity. hundreds of Black Philadelphians contracted the fever. Hundreds died. And when the epidemic finally broke in November, ended at last by the first hard frost, which destroyed the mosquito population that had been spreading it all along, the city's response to the people who had served it was not gratitude. A pamphlet written by a publisher named Matthew Carey, widely circulated and deeply influential, accused Black Philadelphians of having exploited the crisis, of overcharging for their services, of stealing from the homes of the sick and the dead, of profiteering from suffering rather than alleviating it. It was a lie, and Jones and Allen knew it. They responded in print, a pamphlet of their own, methodical and devastating, that documented in precise detail the work the Black community had done, the payments received, the expenses incurred, and the deaths suffered. It was, historians would later note, the first copyrighted pamphlet written by Black American authors in the history of the nation. Carey was eventually forced to revise his account. When the final count was made, more than 5,000 people had died. The capital of the United States had been functionally paralyzed for 3 months. Its government scattered, its streets emptied, its dead too numerous to bury quickly enough. Pennsylvania Hospital had watched most of it from the outside. The institution built on the principle that the sick deserved care, that the city had an obligation to its most vulnerable people, had been unable to meet the greatest test that obligation had ever faced. 5,000 people were still dead, and the city that rebuilt itself in the epidemic's aftermath was a city that understood, for the first time, that medicine alone was not enough, that the question of who gets to be saved was not only a medical question, it was a political one, a moral one, and, as Jones and Allen had made undeniably clear, a racial one. Chapter 6. Gender, Medicine, and the Jeering Episode. The surgical amphitheater at Pennsylvania Hospital had seen a great deal by the middle of the 19th century. It had held hundreds of spectators watching surgeons work without anesthesia. It had been, for 6 decades, the primary classroom of American surgical education, a place where suffering and learning occupied the same space, where the audience and the patient existed in a relationship that was, at its core, deeply unequal. On the 6th of November, 1869, it became the site of a different kind of violence entirely. The exclusion of women from formal medical education in America had never been accidental. It was deliberate, defended vigorously, and dressed in the language of both science and propriety. Women, the argument went, lacked the intellectual temperament for medicine. The operating theater and the lecture hall were male spaces, and their maleness was treated not as a historical accident, but as a natural condition, as fixed and obvious as the laws of anatomy. In 1850, a group of Quaker men and abolitionists in Philadelphia decided to challenge that directly. They chartered the Woman's Medical College of Pennsylvania, the first institution in the world established specifically to grant medical degrees to women. It was, like the founding of Pennsylvania Hospital, a radical act dressed in quiet, practical language. The college opened its doors, began training students, and immediately confronted the wall that stood between its graduates and the clinical experience they needed to actually practice medicine. That wall had a specific address, 8th and Pine. The woman who spent the most years throwing herself against it was Anne Preston. A Quaker physician and abolitionist, Preston had been among the college's first graduating class and had risen by 1867 to become its dean, the first woman to hold that title at any medical school in America. For years, she had been negotiating, petitioning, and arguing for the right to bring her students to Pennsylvania Hospital's clinical lectures, where they could observe real patients, real diagnoses, and real procedures alongside the male students from the city's other medical schools. For years, the answer had been some form of no. In the autumn of 1869, the answer changed. The hospital's board granted permission. Preston organized a group of between 20 and 30 female students and brought them to the amphitheater for a scheduled clinical lecture. They paid for their tickets of admission, the same price the male students paid. They took their seats, and then the male students made their feelings known. What followed lasted 2 hours. The women were met with hissing and stamping the moment they entered the hall. Catcalls echoed off the domed ceiling. Paper missiles and tobacco were thrown from the upper rows. The noise was, by multiple accounts, so sustained and so loud that the lecturing physicians could barely be heard. One hospital manager rushed into the room and pleaded with the male students to remember their character as gentlemen. He was knocked aside when they surged through a barrier he tried to hold. A second manager followed, his voice shaking, repeating that the Pennsylvania hospital would not have this. The women did not move. They did not retaliate. They did not leave. Student Elizabeth Keller later described entering the hall amid jeers and groanings, whistling and stamping of feet, by the men students who had determined to make it so unpleasant for them that, from choice, they would not care to attend another. Anna Broomall, who would go on to become one of the most respected obstetricians in America, said she had scarcely heard a word of what the preceptors had been trying to tell them. They stayed anyway. They listened to what they could hear, and when it was over, they left. Philadelphia's newspapers covered the incident extensively. Most sided with the women, though the reasoning offered was revealing. The objection was not that women deserved to study medicine. The objection was that the male students had behaved in a manner unbecoming of gentlemen. The women's right to be in that room was, for the most part, a secondary concern. The episode became known immediately and permanently as the Jeering episode. It was covered in newspapers across the country. It became a defining story in the history of the Women's Medical College, passed down through generations of its students and alumnae as both a wound and a point of pride. Pennsylvania Hospital's response unfolded at the speed that institutions typically reserve for changes they find uncomfortable. A nurse training program for women was established 6 years later in 1875. The first female intern did not walk through the hospital's doors until 1951. 82 years after the women who had paid for their tickets of admission were driven from that amphitheater. None of it was incidental. None of it was the behavior of outliers. It was the medical profession, the same profession that produced Rush's compassion and physics brilliance, operating according to the values and the hierarchies of its time. But the suffering was not wasted. That is the thing this building's history insists upon, if you look at it honestly. The basement cells are part of why psychiatry developed the concept of patient dignity and, eventually, informed consent. The surgical theater's era of unmedicated public operations is part of why the medical community pursued anesthesia and antiseptic technique with such urgency. The epidemic deaths and Carrie's slander are part of why the history of racial equity in American medicine has been fought for at all, because Jones and Allen refused to let the record stand uncorrected. And Ann Preston students who endured 2 hours of assault without flinching are part of why the majority of medical school students in America today are women. The price was real. It was paid by people who had no choice but to pay it, in rooms they had every right to occupy. What was purchased with that price was not given freely. It was taken, slowly, painfully, across generations, by people who refused to accept that the way things were was the way things had to be. The building at 8th and Pine was not always on the right side of that argument, but it was always in the room. Chapter 7. Growth and Firsts. Medicine does not become a profession all at once. It becomes one slowly through accumulation, through the building of libraries and the writing of textbooks, the training of students and keeping of records, through the gradual, unglamorous work of turning individual knowledge into shared knowledge, and that shared knowledge into institutional practice. Pennsylvania Hospital did not set out to build a profession. It set out to care for the sick poor of Philadelphia. But in doing so, decade by decade, it became something larger than its founders had imagined, a place where American medicine learned what it was. That process began with books. In 1762, a British physician named John Fothergill, a friend of Benjamin Franklin's and one of the most respected doctors in London, donated the first volume to the hospital's medical library. It was a single book, but the library grew the way all libraries grow when the institution behind them takes seriously the idea that knowledge must be preserved and passed on. By 1847, nearly a century after Fothergill's gift, the American Medical Association formally designated Pennsylvania Hospital's collection as the largest, most comprehensive medical library in the United States. It held approximately 9,000 volumes at that point. Today the number exceeds 13,000, including medical and scientific texts dating to the 15th century, books printed before the Americas were known to Europe, before germ theory, before surgery was anything other than a last resort. The library was not decoration, it was infrastructure. A physician who could not consult the accumulated knowledge of his field was working in isolation, dependent entirely on what he had personally witnessed or been taught. The library was the mechanism by which Pennsylvania Hospital connected its staff to the broader world of medical thinking, and in time, contributed to it. The apothecary told a similar story. From its earliest years, the hospital maintained the first apothecary shop in any American hospital, a dispensary stocked initially with 112 pounds of drugs imported from London, because there was no domestic pharmaceutical supply capable of meeting demand. The medicines themselves were a mixture of the useful and the uncertain. Digitalis for heart conditions, herbal preparations whose effects were understood through centuries of observation rather than clinical trial. But the apothecary represented something important, the idea that medicine required materials, that those materials required expertise to prepare and dispense, and that a hospital had an obligation to provide both. There had been plans as early as 1774 for a physic garden on the hospital grounds, a plot of land where medicinal plants would be grown and tended, providing physicians with ingredients for their preparations. The board of managers approved the idea. Then, the Revolutionary War arrived. The war tested everything about the hospital's founding principles. When British forces occupied Philadelphia in 1777, Pennsylvania Hospital treated their wounded soldiers alongside the Continental troops it had already been caring for. The Good Samaritan did not ask which army a bleeding man had fought for. 4 members of the hospital's board of managers were exiled from the city for their political affiliations. The institution suffered financially for years after the occupation ended. Its resources depleted, its staff diminished, its mission strained nearly to breaking by the demands of a war it had not anticipated and could not refuse. It survived, and it kept working. The physic garden waited. It waited for 2 full centuries. In 1976, as the United States marked its 200th year, the Philadelphia Committee of the Garden Club of America and the Friends of Pennsylvania Hospital finally planted it, a small, formal garden of 18th-century medicinal plants installed in front of the Pine Building's west wing. On ground the hospital's founders had imagined for exactly this purpose 2 centuries before. It still grows there today. Meanwhile, the science was moving. Benjamin Rush died in 1813. The year before his death, he published the work that would outlast almost everything else he had done, Medical Inquiries and Observations. Upon the Diseases of the Mind, the first comprehensive textbook of psychiatry, written and published in the United States. It was a direct product of the 30 years he had spent working with the patients in the basement cells, then in the dedicated ward he had fought to establish. The cells had been a failure of imagination. The textbook was imagination's partial recovery, an attempt to build a science out of suffering, to extract from the hospital's darkest rooms something that might eventually lead somewhere better. The operating rooms were changing too. In the years around 1848, ether anesthesia arrived at Pennsylvania Hospital. The transition was gradual, contested in some quarters, adopted case by case. But it came, and with it, the era of the screaming amphitheater began its long fade toward obsolescence. Surgery could now be performed on a patient who was not fully conscious of what was happening. Surgeons could take time. They could be careful in ways the amphitheater had never permitted. The amphitheater closed in 1868. By then, the Civil War had already delivered a lesson that the hospital, and the entire American medical establishment, had been slow to absorb. Organized nursing saved lives. This had been demonstrated across 4 years of battlefield medicine, in conditions so large in scale that the evidence could not be dismissed. The Civil War, along with the broader nursing reform movement taking shape on both sides of the Atlantic, made clear that the people who spent the most hours at a patient's bedside deserved to be trained, credentialed, and taken seriously as professionals. In 1883, influenced by these lessons, Pennsylvania Hospital opened its first formal nurse training school, a program that acknowledged, however belatedly, that care and competence were not separate things. It was a beginning. It was also, like so many of the hospital's beginnings, later than it should have been. But the architecture of a profession is built like the architecture of a building, one course of brick at a time. Not always plumb, not always square, revised and reinforced as the weaknesses become apparent. Pennsylvania Hospital had been building for over a century. It was nowhere near finished. Chapter 8. Survival, Reinvention, Continuity. Most institutions do not last. This is the quiet truth that sits beneath the history of American medicine, that the hospitals and asylums and charitable dispensaries that once defined the landscape of a city have not survived. They were absorbed into larger systems, closed when their funding collapsed, demolished to make way for something newer and more profitable, or simply abandoned when the population they served moved somewhere else. The history of American healthcare is littered with the ghosts of institutions that began with the same mixture of idealism and practicality that animated Pennsylvania Hospital in 1751, and that did not make it to the next century, let alone the one after that. Pennsylvania Hospital made it to all of them. That fact alone demands some reflection. The building at 8th and Pine has survived the every wave of consolidation and restructuring that has swept through American medicine in the past 100 years. It has survived the departure of its psychiatric patients, the closure of its amphitheater, and the transformation of medicine from a discipline practiced by individual physicians into a vast interconnected system of specialties, technologies, and regulatory frameworks that Benjamin Franklin would have found entirely incomprehensible. It survived by doing what it had always done, adapting without abandoning. In the summer of 1941, a young man named Charles Everett Koop arrived at Pennsylvania Hospital to begin his medical internship. He had grown up in Brooklyn, earned his medical degree from Cornell, and already fixed his ambitions firmly on surgery, a choice that would eventually make him one of the most celebrated pediatric surgeons in the world. These halls were where he began. Koop would go on to serve as Surgeon General of the United States from 1982 to 1989. One of the most influential and most scrutinized holders of that office in the nation's history, leading public health campaigns on smoking, AIDS awareness, and the rights of vulnerable patients. He had started here. That is what institutions do when they function as they should. They shape the people who pass through them. They transmit something that cannot be fully articulated in a curriculum or a policy document, a sense of what medicine is for and what it had cost to get this far. The pressures of the late 20th century were real and could not be wished away. Standalone charitable hospitals across America were discovering that the economics of modern healthcare, the cost of technology, the complexity of insurance systems, the capital requirements of keeping pace with medical advances, were increasingly difficult to sustain independently. In 1997, Pennsylvania Hospital's Board of Managers voted to merge with the University of Pennsylvania Health System. The institution that had been founded on matching grants and Quaker philanthropy became part of one of the great academic medical systems in the country, gaining access to resources and research infrastructure that no standalone hospital could generate on its own. It was not a surrender. It was a recognition that survival required the same pragmatic intelligence that Franklin had brought to the matching grant in 1751. The medicine happening inside the building had traveled to places the founders could not have mapped. In 1996, according to hospital records, a physician named Patricia Ford performed the first successful bloodless stem cell transplant at Pennsylvania Hospital, a procedure that used the body's own biology in ways that bypassed the need for conventional blood transfusion entirely, opening possibilities for patients whose medical or personal circumstances made traditional methods inadvisable. In 2001, the hospital marked its 250th anniversary. The Pine Building, the original structure, was designated a National Historic Landmark. The surgical amphitheater at its top, where so much had happened for so long, was preserved and open to the public. Visitors can walk up the stairs, take in the circular rows of wooden benches, look up at the skylight, and try to imagine what it meant to lie on the table below it. Today, Pennsylvania Hospital is a 515-bed, private nonprofit teaching hospital consistently ranked among the top 2% of hospitals in the United States. It trains physicians, it conducts research, it cares for patients from across the region, from every background, in every condition, the sick and the injured and the frightened and the hopeful, arriving at the same corner where the sick poor of colonial Philadelphia once came with nowhere else to go. The doors are still open, the work is still happening, the the building is still standing. Chapter 9: What Pennsylvania Hospital Taught Us. This building was shaped by people whose names we know. Franklin, who understood that a good idea needed a political strategy to survive. Bond, who saw the suffering on the streets of his city and could not look away from it. Rush, who was brave and brilliant and wrong in ways that cost his patients dearly, and who kept working anyway. Physic, who brought a cold and exacting precision to a room that had previously been governed by speed and desperation. Preston, who walked into this amphitheater knowing what was waiting for her and walked in anyway. And it was shaped just as permanently by people whose names we do not know. They are this building's truest history, not the charted firsts and the celebrated physicians. Them too, but not only them. Pennsylvania Hospital did not always get it right. It got a great deal wrong, but it kept showing up. It kept its doors open through everything that reshaped what medicine was supposed to be and who it was supposed to serve. There is a seal on this building that has been there since the beginning. It shows a figure kneeling beside a man left broken on the road, a stranger with no claim on anyone's time or resources or compassion. Beneath the image run 8 words that Thomas Bond and Benjamin Franklin chose, together as the clearest possible statement of what they were trying to build. Take care of him, and I will repay thee. Not a boast, not a monument to what had already been achieved, but a promise about what was still owed.